people in my family, they just dropped dead. I never had to deal with this prolonged experience. There's a different crisis every week. So I really just tried to educate myself, trying to be patient with him, but at the same time, pushing him in the sense of your mom is dying, but you're not. This could potentially go. She could live like this for another 15 years. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way I'm not traveling for the next 15 years.
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today we have with us Sara Tyler, published author, entrepreneur, and the founder of Nomad Publishing. Hola, Sara.
Hi, good
Bienvenida.
morning. Bienvenido, gracias.
Good morning and afternoon from my end. By the way, I was just curious because your name in America, I assume they pronounce it as Sarah, but then of course I assume when you go to the Spanish country, they will be like, Hola, Sara.
I'm fine with either one, Sarah or Sarah. Everybody asks me that, and I'm good either way.
I know it's very funny because it's the same as my name. When people ask, it's like, is it Rex or Rex? I'm like, I have no idea. It sounds the same to me.
Yeah, I don't even know anymore.
Cool. Yeah, because you have been spending a lot of time in Mexico. So today we're going to speak a bit about, or this is what I assume, but my listeners know that the podcast flow just goes according to whatever flows. But I'm hoping today to talk a lot about Mexico because this is obviously a very popular destination for nomads and expats, especially in the US. And of course, I would like to dive deep about some of your travel and family happenings, which I reached out to you about because I thought that was super interesting. And then we can talk about some business stuff regarding publishing as well, because from my angle, I see that you are also a very good storyteller that is also trying to bring out the stories of other travelers and people, right? So exciting conversation ahead that I'm looking forward to. But let's start with an introduction of yourself.
Okay, so basically, I've been living abroad since 2010. So I've lived mostly in Mexico, but I also, as I mentioned, lived in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And I used to teach languages, but I transitioned to publishing with the pandemic. And basically, I started out, solo female traveler, and now I have 2 kids and a partner. So now I still travel by myself when I get the chance, but I also have a little entourage I bring with me too.
Yeah, that's a very brief summary, but I'd like to dive deeper into why did you move to Mexico in the first place? Because I obviously know some of the stories based off articles that were featuring you, and I thought that was interesting because you actually left what I assume was a more toxic relationship and moved to Mexico back then. Give us a little bit of like an introduction on that or what happened and what led you to choose Mexico as the destination.
So actually, when I was in the United States, I've always had really good jobs. I've always been really good at working, and I was working with the NIH on maternal fetal medicine research, which is like, wow, amazing opportunity. But the problem is you don't really make enough money. So I was kind of stuck in this, well, I make more money than the minimum wage, but I don't really make enough money to have my own apartment, to have my own car. I'm kind of stuck right there in the middle. So I was working 2 jobs, super stressed out. I was studying full-time online, going to university online, and I was just like downing Red Bulls every night, trying to stay awake to finish my homework. And it was a very, very stressful. And then at the end of the day, I never had any money to show for it. What are I'm working 80 hours a week, I'm studying, I never had any money at the end of the day. So, I thought about it for a long time. I had fallen in love with Mexico. I was traveling every 3 months. I was traveling to Mexico. At that point, I had I don't know if you remember US Airways. I had a US Airways credit card. So I had like free trips to Bermuda, free trips to Cancun. I was traveling all the time. And I just got to the point where, I don't remember what the straw was. Kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't remember what it was, but I just got to the point where at work I said, I'm sorry, I'm quitting and I'm leaving. And I took my tax return, which wasn't that very much money. I think it was like $2,000. And I just went to Guadalajara, Mexico, and one-way ticket and never looked back.
Well, it's pretty interesting that you're going to Mexico quite frequently. What do you think? Because when I heard about your story and the descriptions that you gave regarding Mexico, it sounds like you're mesmerized by certain things there, and I can definitely kind of relate to it because Mexico has a bit of a special place in my heart because that was the first country that I've been to that is drastically different from the culture that I understood or that I was around, right? I had traveled before going to Mexico, but I was always mainly within the Asia space because I had relatives here and there, so I was traveling. And to share a bit of my story was that I first went to Mexico more than a decade ago. It was for like a summer school kind of thing from the university days. And I wasn't like super interested in travel back then, despite like having been to like a few different places. But it was just nice that a few weeks before I saw a summer school program for Mexico, my brother was telling me like one of his biggest regrets in university is that he didn't go for as many of like exchange programs and see the world, because everyone was so focused on studying and you're just trying to pass your freaking modules and then like
Yeah, of course.
right, and graduate. So that was how his university life was almost like he didn't really travel as much or go for programs. So he told me that, hey, you should go and check it out. So then I saw that email like coincidentally just 2 weeks later or something in the school mail. And I was like, if I'm going to go somewhere, I'm going to go somewhere far, right, to see something different. And it was kind of a big decision because in the sense that back then it wasn't cheap. Like 10 plus years ago, budget airlines were not as prominent,
Right.
flight routes were not as good. So it was expensive in the sense that my family isn't like well-to-do. So it took a lot of like decision making to get there because I had to get like some funding from the school, and then I took a loan from my parents basically, and then I went to Mexico, right? And I do think that I definitely felt the same as you in like there are certain landscape and stuff that you see that's amazing. Not to mention the food. The food is obviously like crazy.
Oh, the food is.
I still miss the tacos from the streets. I still feel like the tacos from the streets are the best tacos.
They are.
Yeah, so all those, but I thought one of the biggest thing in hindsight, now that I look back, I think it was really the difference in culture, the opening of my eyes to a world that was totally different, that I realized that there are like so many ways to look at the world and what I'm used to, even within the whole Asian continent, and Asia is already pretty diverse. But looking at Mexico, obviously the culture was different, the people were really different, right? And I was there during the World Cup, Yeah, back then it was the World Cup and Mexico was playing in it. So it was crazy. Right, I thought that changed, that got a switch on in my mind, a switch from like, I'm actually fine with not traveling. I think like I'm amazing where I'm at to like, I want to go and see way more different parts of the world. And from then on, every semester break there was, I was overseas. And one of the other countries I went after Mexico was India, which was like another whole different like blow to the mind. And I was like, holy shit, this is like super exciting. And in your case, I realized that you also saw something that just kept drawing you back to Mexico. But you weren't actually that far because you were originally from the States, right? What do you think stood out to you that kept you going back and choosing like different regions to visit?
You're right. There is something about Mexico to me that feels like home. It's hard to explain, but when I get to Mexico, I feel like, okay, I'm comfortable. Just 2 days ago, it was raining really, really bad. And I was trying to drive home, and there was this huge pothole. And since it was raining, it was kind of like the streets were flooding. There was this orange cone that was, warning people about the pothole, and it got washed away. So guess who gets stuck in the pothole? My car, and the tire is just not moving. At least 6 cars stopped, and I mean, families getting out to help me. And finally, because it wasn't moving, like the car, we were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? People were going to their house to get like rope to pull the car out of the pothole, when a whole truck of workers came by, and like 8 workers jumped out. So I had like 10 people lifted my car up by hand out of the pothole to help me. They were all soaking wet. Like, it was raining so hard. That would never happen in the United States. Nobody would stop to help you. People would just keep driving by. and that's the kind of thing that happens here. I think in the countries where there's not as much money, people just naturally help each other out. Doesn't matter if you're a foreigner. They're not expecting anything. When I came to Mexico, I lived in Guadalajara, I lived in Mexico City, Veracruz, Cancun, Playa del Carmen, Progreso, and Chilem, because I always feel like maybe there's something more. I left, I went to El Salvador and Nicaragua, I traveled all over Central America, Colombia, but I would come back to Mexico because it's not the same. Even though they're all Spanish-speaking countries, it's not the same feeling that you have here. Mexico is so diverse. I'm here at the beach right now, but I can get in my car and in 90 minutes, I'm in the mountains where there's snow. It's just, there's something for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. Having traveled a bit in Mexico myself back then, I did go to the very north, like Chihuahua and stuff. And back then I was based in Querétaro, which is almost central Mexico. And after that, I took a trip, obviously, down the south to Oaxaca and then towards the coast. Obviously, the coast, everyone wants to go to the coast. So I definitely agree that the landscape is very different, and it's a place that's worth visiting multiple times, because if you're just checking out one particular region, like if you only do Yucatan and you go to like the central Mexico City, is a whole different vibe almost.
Oh yeah, look at another country.
So I'm also curious why you choose to base ultimately in Veracruz, because obviously for digital nomads, the very common areas to stay in are towards the beaches and stuff, of which I'm actually not super keen at, and especially you are not really like trying to be nomadic, but that's kind of your base almost, right? So choosing a very touristic zone kind of don't make sense, right? And I still remember that when I was at the Cancun site, I didn't really like it. Like I love the beach, obviously, but the vibe was super touristy even back then, and I heard that now it's worse. So, but Veracruz was the place that I had very fond memories of, but I didn't go like, I was there just for a weekend trip. It was my very first weekend trip from Querétaro to travel out and explore the region. So that was super interesting. But to me, as an outsider, I always thought that Veracruz is one of those spots whereby you go for like a weekend trip, basically, like for a visit, right? So what drew you to Veracruz compared to the other regions that you have been to?
Well, actually, I came to Veracruz for the first time when I was working in Mexico City, and I just wanted to go to the beach. So I literally was like, Google Map, what's the closest beach to Mexico City? And I had been to Acapulco, and I'm not a big fan of the Pacific Ocean. So I was like, oh, 5.5 hours. All right, I'm going to Veracruz. And then that's how I kind of made that decision. But the reason I've actually lived in Veracruz 4 times. This is my 4th time. Because again, I get antsy. I'm like, do I really want to live in Veracruz? Let me go live in Cancun. Cancun, as you said, it's Cancun. It's like living in Las Vegas. It's just not, there's not the same culture as there is in Veracruz. So now I'm at a point where I've traveled a lot. My partner is from Veracruz. We're renovating a house here. Definitely, this is our home base. It's so central. I can be in Puebla in 2 hours. I could be in Monterrey. It's an hour flight to Merida, to Cancun. It's an hour flight to Mexico City if I want to go international. It's just like really central, but yet there aren't a lot of foreigners. I like that.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well, because as in like a lot of people or even digital nomads talk about moving to Mexico or using Mexico at least as a base, right? And I think, I'm not sure if this is true, but I think considering the Central America continent, that is almost like a place where you can kind of get like residency in a relatively easier way compared to the other countries. But none of them have, like Veracruz doesn't pop up that often, right? People are definitely looking at Mexico City, the beaches, maybe even Guanajuato, but Veracruz was rare. And hearing from you, it definitely makes sense that, because when I go to a city, for example, and if I want to stay for a longer time, if I visit, I love to stay in the happening part, right? But when I'm staying for long, I prefer to stay just outside the happening part, because that is where you get the most local vibe, probably even the cheaper prices, and also like you get access to more things that are daily amenities compared to short-term interest and stuff. I always use the example of Buenos Aires. Like Palermo is like a super trendy district there. But if I'm staying for long, I wouldn't stay in Palermo because it's filled with cafes and stuff. And if I want to find like a local vegetable shop, it's not as easy. Whereas right next door, 5-10 minutes walk is Villa Crespo, which is like way cheaper and way more local vibe. And then if you want to go to Palermo, it's just a 5-10 minutes walk. So if you blow it up in a bigger scale, I can kind of see how it correlates to, like you say, Mexico City is just 1.5 hours bus ride away. And the buses in Mexico are actually pretty decent.
They are, no, they are. What you were talking about with Buenos Aires, it reminds me of when we lived in Playa del Carmen. We lived in this area called Colosio, which is a local area, but literally 5 minutes walking to the Fifth Avenue and all of the shops and restaurants. But in that area, they don't sell alcohol. So it was great. It was like quiet, family friendly. We were a block and a half from the beach, and we had a furnished apartment for $350 a month. But if you go on the on the Facebook groups, and if you're talking to expats, they'll say, "Oh no, that's a dangerous area." It's not dangerous; it's local. There's nothing dangerous about it.
That's actually a very common debate, I realize, because most of the time, especially because in the more developing countries, if we classify Mexico as that, the more local areas are generally also kind of more charming because you get a lot of, the proper vibes, and a lot of people like that. But for example, again, bringing back to the example of Buenos Aires in reflection, Palermo is always said to be safe because it's where all the tourists are. So there's more like patrol or like police officers. But the problem is also people, the so-called the local criminals, know that that's where the tourists are, which means that's where the rich people are. So that's where they go and start robbing people, right? And then on the other hand, San Telmo, which is a very cultural area, very nice area, and prices are way cheaper. It's further away from the main touristic zones, I would say, but it has a very charming local vibe. But always people will start saying that, hey, that area is not too safe at night and stuff like that. And it's always a debate. So I realized that sometimes it boils down to personal preferences on like deciding, where you want to base yourself.
And I think it's also, it's a valid argument that as foreigners, we're always going to have a different experience than the locals. Okay, so when I moved to Veracruz for like the 3rd time as a single mom with my daughter, at night, babies wake up. She was 3 months old. So I would take her for walks up along the Malecon and the Port of Veracruz at 3, 4 in the morning. Never had a problem. There's patrols that go 24 hours a day. They have like the Marines that go through. I've never had a problem. I've never been mugged. I would say like maybe petty theft on the beach is a problem on some of the beaches. But besides that, for a foreigner here, it's extremely, extremely safe. Every time the traffic police pull me over, they won't even take my bribes. They are so professional and sweet to me. And I'm like, oh, don't take my license. Here, take 500 pesos. They will not. It's like, you're treated differently. And I mean, that's good it's good and it's not good. But when locals say that places are dangerous, I do believe it is dangerous for them as locals. And we have a different experience that we live.
Okay. That being said, what do you think are the main factors for you yourself, considering, I believe, because you also have kids, what are the, I don't know, like top 3 or 5 factors that you consider when selecting, let's say not just a country, but the city you're staying in?
So a lot of people would say price. But for me, I can find a decent price rental anywhere in Mexico. That's like not a problem for me. I speak fluent Spanish. I'm like a bargain hunter. I'll be on the Facebook Marketplace and I will find that. So price really isn't a factor for me. I love living in Progreso in the Yucatan, but when my daughter was like 2.5, about to be 3, there were no school options. There was no daycare. There's no school. It's a very small town. And so that's the reason that I moved back to Veracruz with her, because Veracruz has so many schools. They have a lot of parks. It's very family friendly. It's a medium-sized city, so you have all like the great hospitals similar to Merida, but it's not huge like Mexico City. So when I'm looking for places, I'm definitely looking for the culture. Veracruz is 500 years old. Tons of culture here. I'm looking for the culture. Previously I would look for places where I can practice Spanish. That's not really a problem anymore. And just outdoor, like nature, parks. When I lived in Mexico City, especially, I would have to wake up at like 4 in the morning. And we talked about, I'm not a morning person, but I would have to wake up to get on the metro at 5 a.m. And I would have the worst cough when it rained. The pollution would affect my contact lenses. I was changing them every 2 or 3 weeks. They were too dirty. And so I really wanted to find a place that I could be outdoors.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I definitely do agree with you about Mexico City. It's like, I think it's convenient to stay there just because, like you say, it's the transit hub of everything, right? If you want international flights, if you want to go anywhere, the buses will be there, right? And many times, like staying in somewhere like Querétaro, most of the time, if you want to go somewhere in the country, you have to transit via Mexico City. That's what I found out. So I've been in Mexico City for quite a few times, but I've never really stayed in Mexico City because the thing is that, especially at the bus stations and everything, it feels crazy crowded. Like there's so much hustle and bustle, like and it's true that Mexico City has a lot of culture as well. Like I remember I can't remember, I think it was the Museum of Anthropology or something about the Mayan and Aztec culture. That was like super amazing museum. But I just remember going everywhere, like freaking whole truckloads of people just all around you. So it's like, oh, this place is a bit. If you are someone who enjoys like the more peace and quiet, then you probably got to like find certain spots in Mexico City. But otherwise, the surrounding towns or cities like Veracruz and Querétaro definitely has a way more calm and like a tranquilo vibe, whereby you can just go to the city center, 100%. See people watch. You see the elderly in the morning playing chess and everything. That's probably the image.
No, definitely. When I lived in Mexico City, I mean, the city wakes up so early. You have to, if you're going to get anywhere in the city. I did in company English classes, so I was just traveling everywhere. If you're going to get anywhere, you have to do it at 5 in the morning. And then when I moved to Veracruz, it's this like sleepy beach town. I was waking up at like 6 a.m. Where is everybody? Wait, nothing's open yet? And you kind of get used to people waking up at 9 or 10, having breakfast. You can see everyone on their bicycles. And that's definitely more a speed that I wanted, because I felt like living in Mexico City for a year, I felt like I left the US just to do the same thing.
Gotcha. And how does the cost in Veracruz compare to the other areas? Just for, I assume like there are listeners who are deliberating on like which area should I go to, and there's a lot of travelers that keeps going back to Mexico, but they are kind of sick of like Playa del Carmen, Hobart, Cancun, because that's the first spot they go to, right? And after that, they want to explore the other areas. So because you have traveled to the different areas and also stayed in like many of them, how will you compare the cost between the different regions from a perspective of, say, a tourist or traveler?
Like definitely since the pandemic, Mexico City, Playa del Carmen, Cancun, the whole Riviera Maya and like Puerto Vallarta, it has just shot up. It's just gone up. through the roof. There are so many digital nomads to the point where when we lived in Playa del Carmen during the pandemic for 10 months. My husband's like, am I the only Mexican person in Playa del Carmen? We were just surrounded by Americans, which is fine. I'm not anti-American, but I definitely didn't come to Mexico to live with American people. I wanted to experience local culture. So those areas are just doubled, tripled in prices. We were just having this conversation because I hosted a meetup with the Veracruz expat group this week. And the most expensive high rise here, like on the beach, penthouse apartment, 3 bedrooms, might set you back $1,000 to $1,500 a month.
That's is that like short-term rental, or will you say like you need to do long-term rental to get that price?
I mean, a lot of them are empty. I'm sure it's very flexible, and because nobody here locally is going to pay that much money. But if you took that same penthouse and you're in Playa del Carmen, you're looking at like $5,000-$6,000 a month. I mean, the prices are completely different. In Playa, it's hard to get anything but a studio at this point. Even studios are like $1,000 a month.
And if I were to just ask you, let's say the hotspots gets really crowded and someone wants to develop like a new hub somewhere in Mexico that is still undiscovered or untouched as much, which cities do you think has like the best potential?
A lot of people are in Puebla. I think Puebla is a great city if you like the cooler weather. Puebla, definitely along the Veracruz coast. Tabasco is another place that there's some beaches there. I went down to Oaxaca. I did go to Huatulco, Puerto Escondido in August, and we had a great time. But the internet situation there, I wouldn't even recommend it.
Wow, that's surprising. Yeah, because I thought Oaxaca would have. I think Oaxaca is like a super nice tourist destination for sure. I mean, when I visited, I wasn't like trying to work or anything, so I have no idea of the. And back then, to be honest, the expectations for internet and technology weren't as high because it was like today,
That's
right?
true.
So it was kind of go on.
Well, they told me that I don't know if this is true, but I've been told that it has to do with the mountains. That because of the mountains, that's why the internet's so bad, and then we'll never fix it.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, but then
sense, right?
That's going to be a big problem because if it's the mountains, definitely that's not fixable because that's just part of nature. Okay, cool. But Oaxaca is for the listeners, Oaxaca is like the awesome place to visit for culture,
amazing.
for food, for Dia de los Muertos. That's the place to be. I haven't been myself, but I've heard like it's crazy, like exciting to be there.
No, Oaxaca 100%. Especially there's a lot of people that are retired that move there because they don't necessarily need the fast internet, and the prices are still really good because it's still kind of undiscovered. So the internet being as bad as it is, I think it protects it in a way.
Cool. Let's break down some finances for you, right? Like to give an idea to people who are trying to maybe set up a base there or something. What are your key expenses per month, would you say?
So right now, this year we surprise inherited a house. So instead of paying rent right now, we're renovating. But last year we had a 2-bedroom apartment, half a block from the beach, completely furnished with a pool, and that was $400 a month. And that's on the pricier end. But I wanted to be really close to the beach. I'm not gonna lie. And it was a 6-month rental, so that's a little more expensive. But I would say here, because there's so much beach. I mean, Veracruz is a state that goes on for like 9 hours. You could be driving and you're still in Veracruz. If you want to be in this general area with the port, Boca del Rio, you still have a good 20, 30 miles of beach. So you can still find really, really cheap prices. I'm talking $200 to $300.
Wow. Yeah, that's actually cheap.
No, there's still great prices. I mean, sometimes I look on the marketplace, I'm like, why do I have a family? Because the studios here, the furnished studios right there by the beach. You have your internet, you have your, electricity, usually your cable TV, and you might be 2 or 3 blocks from the beach, $200. How easy is that?
Yeah, that's minimal in my opinion. I think like for $200 for monthly rent. And then how about food and transportation?
So one of the things I really like about Veracruz is before I had kids, not obviously I have a car because who wants to have 2 little kids and getting on the bus and getting off the bus? But one of the things I always liked about it is before I never had a car and I walked everywhere. It's a very walkable city. There are taxis. It's different than like Cancun and Playa del Carmen. When you get in a taxi here, the rates are right there on the windshield. So
Mhm.
it's super easy because if you're going from zone 1 to zone 2, that's 35 pesos. There's no price gouging because it's right there on the windshield. So they're very affordable. There's no Uber. There is Uber, but don't use it. It's that kind of situation.
Yeah,
There is, but the taxi drivers will get very angry if you use it.
that
Um,
seems to be the situation in most Latin American countries, I realize.
yeah. And honestly, the taxis are so plentiful and cheap here. There's really not a need for Uber. The buses, I haven't taken a bus in a couple of years, but I think they're 12 or 13 pesos. Buses everywhere, like most of Mexico, public transportation is just easy and cheap to find. But I could go all week and never have to use my car, to be honest. I have on the corner, I have like a fruit vegetable store. In front of the house, there's a corner market. There is the butcher shop. My daughter's school is 1 block this way. I really don't have to use a
Wow.
car.
Yeah, so that your location is pretty good in the sense of like local amenities. Like we were talking about, right? That is kind of the thing that you really want to be super close to if you're staying long term, rather than you can't be clubbing
Yeah.
every freaking night or like going to like the fancy restaurants every night, right? So ultimately, the location does matter in terms of like what are the amenities surrounding you. That will give you a lot of convenience, I assume. Got it.
And
And
I like that too. I like to go to get like fresh fruits and vegetables every morning. Like I like that. I like to eat local and healthy and try to avoid places like Walmart and and Sam's Club, those big places.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And how would you say, is it easy to survive without Spanish in Mexico or even in a place like because you can imagine the advantage of going to like Cancun and stuff is that obviously with English you can totally do like almost everything because tourism
You
is a big
can.
industry.
You can. There are expats that come here that don't speak Spanish, but I don't recommend it because you're going to pay more for everything. You're going to find a doctor. You're going to find doctors here in Mexico. Everybody that goes to college has to take 2 semesters of English, so everybody has like a basic working knowledge of English. You're going to find professionals, but you're just going to pay so much more because they speak English.
Mhm.
And I understand it. I mean, if you're sick, you don't want to be like hacking your way through Spanish. You want to be able to say what's wrong with you. I completely understand it. But I think the technology has come so far with Google Translate and the different options that you have to try. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you try, you're going to get so much further than if you
Mhm.
don't.
Yeah, and Mexico is actually one of the better destinations within Latin America for language learning and cultural immersion, I would say. Like having been to
Mhm.
South America and Central America, there are certain spots that are just way better. I don't know, because of whatever reason. Like for example, if you go to South America, Peru, Colombia are definitely the core countries where people want to go and do like cultural immersion. Some do it in Bolivia because it's super cheap. But
Mhm.
Mexico, I've heard a lot about. I myself, when I took Spanish and Mexican culture, basically, which I understand was what you intended to do when you first got there as well.
I did. I took a college course. It was Mexican culture and history, but it wasn't, one course is not enough.
For sure, for sure. I think the thing about it is that so I took the course because it just maps to a certain module. But what I really love, and I still remember the professor today, was that he was so encouraging in me traveling because obviously I'm there every weekend trying to go somewhere. And some
Mhm.
weekends I don't return until like Tuesday because I just decided to spend the Monday somewhere else. Because I'm like, if I took a freaking bus all the way to Chihuahua, which is like such a freaking long journey, I don't want to spend 2 days and come back, right? But he
Right.
was so encouraging. He was like, yeah, go, because like if you really want to know the culture and enjoy it, you have to do it in real life. Like you can't just learn it from the books.
My husband always jokes. He's like, you know more. He just says, I know more about Mexico than he does. We just got back actually from Bacalar 2 weeks ago. We went to Bacalar and Palenque. Oh, it was just Bacalar it surprised me in such a good way. I could go back again and again. We had so much fun there.
Wow, I've never been. I've never even heard of Bacala. Shit. I've heard of
It's a
Palenque, of course.
lagoon. It's a
Ah,
lagoon. It's called a lagoon that has 7 colors because there's so many different blue colors in the lagoon. There's cenotes, and it was just great because there was none of nasty seaweed. Very safe to swim in with the kids, and it's the low season, so we basically had the whole campsite to ourselves. It was great.
gotcha. Yeah, I definitely need to check that out again when I'm heading there. There's like so many places that I still want to see in Mexico. Spend
That's
like
the thing,
freaking
you never finished.
yeah, you never finish it. I spent like 3, 4 months there, and there are still a lot of even if you don't talk about the hot places, right? Like the hot spots.
Mhm.
Oh no, even if we don't talk about the hidden local gems, right? The hot spots like Acapulco and which you apparently didn't like, but like some of like La Huasteca, all those I haven't been as well. So I was like, oh, there's still a lot to see there.
No, you never finish. I mean, I lived in Mexico City for a year, and I still go back to visit because there's places I haven't seen.
and And what do you think about you touch a bit on this, but I'm obviously still a bit cautious regarding scams and stuff, right? Or like, I think there's two angles. One is that obviously they see that you are tourist and they try and scam you, or they see that you are tourist and just openly charges you a higher price because that's what happens in some countries. How do you get around this in Mexico?
So I always call it the Gringo tax.
Yes, the Gringo tax.
In places like Playa del Carmen, even in Progreso, that's pretty open. I remember one time, this is recently, we were leaving Xel-Ha, the park, and we had gotten passes because a friend of my husband works at the park. So we got like their buddy pass or family pass. I think we paid like $25 each. It was great. And we were leaving the park and there was just a whole line of taxi drivers. And we said, oh, you know, how much for a taxi to the highway to get the bus? And they wanted to charge us $20. And I looked at the map on my phone. I'm like, it's 200 meters. We're walking. I'm not paying $20 for that. But it's the attitude of, well, I'd rather overcharge these people and like risk not having any work at all, because nobody was picking up the taxis for that price. But it's just this like expectation of, if you're not giving me dollars, and they didn't want pesos, if you're not giving me dollar bills, well, then you're not worth my time. So that does happen in places like that. One of the things I like about Veracruz, and especially when you're going to like the Pueblos Mágicos and places that don't have a lot of international tourists, is they're not used to doing that. You're not getting overcharged like you are in the places with a lot of tourism. I think it helps just to know the prices. I mean, if I don't know what a kilo of avocados cost, of course I'm going to get ripped off eventually. So you kind of have to just know what the prices are. Everything is going up in price at this point, like, you know, everywhere else in the world.
Yep.
Unfortunately.
So you reckon speaking Spanish wouldn't help as much if you look like you or look like me, who obviously look like we are tourists? Even if you go there and speak Spanish, that doesn't help as much as like just understanding that this is going to happen and then like just have a more positive
attitude. Speaking Spanish, you honestly, if you speak Spanish, if you try to speak Spanish, just make like the tiniest little effort, people are so much nicer to you. They are much nicer to you. And it doesn't happen to me a lot, because what I'll do is I'll just ask a couple of people like, hey, how much should I pay? I'm going to get a taxi. How much should I pay to go here? Ask 2 or 3 people in Spanish and you know more or less what the price is. And so you can call them out on it and say, hey, no, last time I paid 35 pesos. Okay, give me 35 pesos, you know? But you, again, you go going back to the Spanish, and you don't need to learn a lot of Spanish, but definitely knowing your prices, your numbers, and a few key verbs is it's gonna get you most of the way.
Yep. Yeah. So I do reckon learning the language is important in both like daily lifestyle, and I would say understanding the culture a lot more. When you can speak the language I would reckon if you can speak it in a deeper level, the more you get out of the trip there, basically, right? And so we have heard a lot about, of course, the pros of going to Mexico. I think like the food, the people, the price. What do you think has been some of the biggest downside that you face living in Mexico?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not one of those like nomads or expats. It's like, it's perfect here, you know. A lot of times people get mad if you say anything negative about the place they chose to live. But definitely, I always say Mexico is like 30 years behind the US. You know, having to always have cash on me, it kills me, because I constantly have to go to the ATM, constantly looking for an ATM. I don't like to stand in line. And so my husband, he'll see a line and he's like, we're going somewhere else, because he knows I'm not going to stand there for an hour in line. I'm not going to do it. You know, the customer service is lacking in a lot of places. In the United States, I mean, if I had, I don't know, these headphones that I just bought, I could bring these back, you know, used, and I would get a refund at Walmart. Here, you cannot return anything. It doesn't matter what the reason is. So there's a lot of differences in the way that you're treated as a customer. At the bank always seems to have the longest lines. I don't understand what people are doing at the bank, but there's always like a line 30 people long to get into the bank. And in the US, everything's on our phone. We have an app. Nobody goes to the bank anymore.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of improvement for efficiency, I would say.
Definitely sounds like it. Yeah.
You know, again, with an app, every single store you can pay with credit cards. You just download an app, but people don't, you know, so there's a lot of room just to educate people and to show them all these new options that are available.
Got it. So yeah, it does sound like something from like almost just a time thing. Like I reckon as time goes by and technology improves, those are bound to come up. But it's just now it's still like a lot of the issues you mentioned are like things of what developed countries face in the past as well, but it's just getting way better now because everything is done in on the phone and on tech, and there's less queuing at the banks. Nowadays, it's also weird when I go to developed countries and the banks are also taking very long because the thing is that they know that there are lesser customers, so they're also cutting down the manpower. And so anything that you have to go to the bank to do is always like a bad thing because you're like, shit, now I have to wait this and that and everything.
And honestly, I don't have a Mexican bank account because we had the worst experiences. The last time we had a Mexican bank account, I was pregnant, and I think we opened the account with $300, and it just disappeared.
That's not good.
And I go to my husband. I said, go to the bank and ask her. It's like the principal. Where did the $300 go? And they're like, we don't know where it went. And I was pregnant, and oh man, I was so angry because when you're pregnant, you have these hormones. I went to the bank and I did a Facebook Live from the bank, and I was like, there are 4 people here, and none of them wanted to like figure out where the money went. But I did a Facebook Live, and I was a total Karen. But I was just really just like, how can this be possible? And my husband was able to go to the regional office and get the money back. And since then, I'm like, I'm not even doing Mexican banking because it's happened to me too. They charge you for a bank account. It takes like 3 hours to open it. Like it's the least inefficient thing in the entire world, and money just disappears. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's definitely
You never
scary.
get the apps to work.
I think this is also where, like, when you have visited this country or stay in this country, that's where you really find the gratitude in. For example, like I was complaining, yes, wait time at the banks are long, but at least I know that putting a bank money in my local bank will not go missing, or someone is definitely accountable for it, right? But whereas in a lot of these countries, even in Argentina, money just goes missing, or like the government can just take the money and for whatever reason.
It happened like a lot. And when you hear these stories, and that's another thing when you're talking with locals, and everybody has the same stories, so you kind of figure out what not to do. Luckily now there's a lot of good options, TransferWise, like PayPal. There's a lot of better options for banking, but I just stay away from the Mexican banks, because then you're also, like you said, the government's going to come looking for their taxes too, and I'm not making money in Mexico, so they shouldn't be coming for it.
Got it. So are your kids holding a Mexican passport or nationality, or do you plan to have them holding a Mexican?
They are. My kids are Mexican. The youngest one was born during the pandemic, so honestly, she's like my little illegal baby. She doesn't have her paperwork yet because the embassy's closed down. But at this point, I'm just going to get her the Mexican passport, because the places that we're planning to travel, we don't need a U.S. passport, and they're very expensive. For us to get U.S. passports, mine's almost expired too. We would have to go to Mexico City or Merida. There's 3 of us that need them. Plus, my youngest daughter needs her birth certificate, her consular birth, report of birth abroad, and her social security number. So it would probably cost us like $1,500. And to go get a Mexican one, we just go right up the street. It's ready in an afternoon. It's like $25.
But you guys can hold both, right? As far as I understand.
They can have both, but there's just no reason. And a lot of times when you travel on a U.S. passport, the visas are higher. There's exit taxes in Latin American countries. So actually, it's kind of better to go on. It's only a problem if they're going to visit the U.S. They would need their U.S. passport, but we're not planning to travel there.
Right. Okay, cool. And speaking about family, I want to take some time to dive into this story that you posted. And I definitely understand it's a bit of a touchy, sensitive topic. So
no, it's okay.
Yeah. So if there's anything, you don't have to answer everything, or we can also change the topic and stuff. Yeah. So this was what caught my attention when I was looking through your profile, and there was this story you were talking about family being like a huge culture, particularly for Mexicans and in Latin America, right? And I'm assuming compared to the US, this family bonding culture is stronger there, because I myself see a lot in Asia. Like in Asia, for us, kids don't just leave home after a certain age. Let's just put it that way. We don't have the idea that if you don't leave, you are like a failure to launch kind of thing. In fact, like the common thought process is that I'll stay with my parents until I get married. So until I form a family of my own, it's okay to stick with the parents, and parents want the kids near them, right? I think Latin America has sort of a bit of the same culture. And basically your story, or the part that I know of it, was that your in-laws had like a problem with one of them passed away during COVID, and the other one is now bedridden with like not so good health, right? And the thing about this is also that this has been something on my mind as well, because as I grow older and my parents grow older, I always have a fear that, hey, what if one day my parents are not well enough to to handle themselves or handle their own day-to-day life, right? And I understand obviously that there is that responsibility to be there, and it's just that it's just right for us to be there. But the problem is that when you have to do it, sometimes things just sucks, right? Like in real practicality, it's not easy. I was fortunate enough to have my grandparents stay with me in their later years. And back then, in the last few years, obviously their health wasn't good. So I remember having to pour like the shit out of the portable toilet and everything. And like old people, when they get older, maybe they don't hear as well and they're more stubborn and they want to do things that they want to do.
Also stubborn.
Yeah, so that definitely sucks in some sense, although that we have a gratitude for it. How do you, and you were talking about balancing basically the need to be near family and the desire to travel. And I think there are a lot of times where people want to travel and they talk about missing family events in the sense of the good events, right? Like the wedding or maybe the birth of the baby. And I think this is obviously one level, but I think the other level is that these are events that you almost have a responsibility to be there because it's one of your loved ones not being able to take care of themselves, right? So talk to me about, and I understand that you also mentioned that there's no real solution to this, right? But I guess it's the management of your mindset, right? How do you balance this and cope with it such that, you don't let it pull you down, but instead be able to, fight through it?
No, you're right. This is something that people really don't talk about. For me, my parents both passed away like 10 and 8 years ago. So my parents, American culture, were not as tight knit to begin with as Latin American culture, like you mentioned. So there was never any expectation of me taking care of them to begin with, but they passed away very suddenly. So I don't really have, family the way that my husband does. My husband's one of 10. He's the baby. My husband has a physical disability, so he's even more like the baby. And what happened was, after my father-in-law passed away, he didn't pass away from COVID, but he passed away right during COVID, just from old age. And I think he had cirrhosis of the liver. We wanted to be a little closer to my mother-in-law because she's alone. She got very needy. We brought her out to live with us in Playa del Carmen. She saw the beach for the first time, actually got in a swimming pool for the first time. So she had all these amazing, firsts at 80 years old. And about 8 months ago, she had a very, very bad stroke. And this is definitely where you see the difference between a developing country and, countries like in Europe and the US. It took hours for the ambulance to come, hours. So I remember we actually got there way before the ambulance, and she couldn't speak, but she could lift her arms, and she actually got up and walked to the ambulance. But it took so long to get her registered at the hospital and to get her looked at, that in one day she went from walking to being bedridden, diapers. She had to have a feeding tube implanted into her stomach, so we give her syringes of basically like baby food. She can't smile, she can't talk, can't cry, So it went from having, I always say this pain in my ass mother-in-law. I joke about it because she was a pain in the ass because she's certainly needy, but she's a good grandmother. She's a good mother-in-law. But it went from that to having an infant, a very large old infant. And it's not even just taking care, because my husband and his sisters, they see it as a privilege. They think it's a privilege to take care of her and to do this for her. But there's so much expense too. All the diapers, all the medicine, all the dressings, the special mattresses, that all has to come out of pocket. So we all try to chip in to take care of her that way. But it's hard. For the first 6 months, my husband did not want to travel.
Mm-hmm.
Me being the American, I'm like, can't we put her in a home? Come on, there's got to be a nursing home around here. And my husband and my sister-in-laws were like, no way. They do not treat them well. No way. We're not putting her in a home. So 24 hours a day, there's basically 4 siblings that live in the area. They're taking care of her 24 hours a day. And for the first 6 months, he did not want to leave her. He was so scared, oh my gosh, if we travel, what if she dies, when we're traveling? But in the past 2 months, I finally gotten him to travel a little bit, because this could go on for years.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, put yourself in her situation. Do you really want everybody to stop their lives? No, of course not. You would want them to keep going on with their lives and living.
Got it. Yeah, I can definitely see both perspectives as well, because I reckon my dad was kind of a bit of the same way to my grandmother. He always felt like there's a responsibility to it. And I think it took quite a long time for my dad even to get over the passing away, because he always felt like now he's an orphan because having lost both his parents, although it's kind of weird because like a grown man with like, of course, kids that are like my age, but he still feels that. I can definitely get the same vibe that probably your husband is having as well, because thinking that, especially if she passes away when he's traveling. But what do you think was a good, and I'm not sure if you had a mechanism, but what do you think was something that you did, or maybe some talks that you had to yourself to be able to, because there's obviously a bit of a cultural difference here, I reckon, in the
Right.
perspective of it, right? So how do you manage that to say, I understand that, that this needs to be done now and it takes time to get over, like certain mindset considerations?
I personally, I researched a lot online about, because even though my mother-in-law has not passed away, my husband's going through a grieving process. It's a grieving process. So I really tried to educate myself. Like I said, people in my family, they just dropped dead. I never had to deal with this prolonged experience. And we're all very much in agreement that she's suffering. This is not an easy death. She's very much suffering. There's surgery. She almost lost her leg, constantly getting tested for pneumonia, nebulizers. There's a different crisis every week. So I really just tried to educate myself, trying to be patient with him, but at the same time, pushing him in the sense of, your mom is dying, but you're not. This could potentially go. She could live like this for another 15 years. We don't know. And there's no way I'm not traveling for the next 15 years. We have the technology. When we travel, we do video calls with her, even though she can't talk back. You can see around her eyes that she lights up, especially with the grandchildren. So it's not as touchy as it was in the beginning with my husband. In the beginning, he was more upset about it. But like it's that balance. It's that balance, because she's suffering. We don't have to make ourselves suffer, right?
Got it. Yeah, because one of the things you were saying in your post was that your mother-in-law, from her angle, she would like you guys to continue on with your life and what you like to do as well, right? Because I can imagine, well, I don't know, because I'm not in the situation, but I can imagine if the day that I'm dying, I'll probably be like, I don't want me to kind of like be a burden to my loved ones to like stop their life and everything, right? Ultimately, I guess I definitely still love the company, but definitely I don't want to be something that restricts them and pull them from doing the things they like, right? I reckon, because you mentioned about the grandchildren being around her and like it's something that she enjoyed, were you able to pull any positivity from it to basically, help you to look at it from a positive note to get through it?
Well, my children are the favorite. Okay, everybody knows this in the family because my husband's like the baby. My daughters are definitely the favorite grandchildren because my husband's very close with his mother, so they always spend a lot of time together. So they're like the favorite grandchildren. So we there's kind of a schedule where we're three sisters and my husband. There's just a schedule. So sometimes my husband, we're only 2 blocks away from her house. Sometimes he's there 3 to 4 times a day because he's helping to move her from a chair to the bed, because she has to be in different positions so she doesn't get bed sores. Like I said, there's sorry, my contact is like.
Oh, that's fine.
So sometimes he's going there like 3 to 4 times a day just to help move her. So I wouldn't feel guilty if we were traveling and something happened, because I know that he goes above and beyond. I bring the kids there at least once a day. We're there just sitting next to her. They're playing. You can tell she's smiling with her eyes, even though she can't smile with her mouth. I know that we're doing above and beyond. It's not a comparison, but if we were comparing to other people in the family, I mean, we definitely spend a lot of time with her. And we spent time with her, the past 2 years since my father-in-law passed away. We've really, really spent a lot more time with her, knowing that she didn't have much time left,
Yeah. I guess it's also a very personal decision in the sense of like, well, for me, this is the way I look at it, right? Like ultimately, your life is your regret, right? So it's in being able to get through that, it's also you determining what you felt was right or was sufficient, so-called, right? If you want to put it that way, was sufficient in terms of like of fulfilling your duty in that sense, right? As long as you feel like, hey, actually, I've done like enough, I try my best to make sure, like you say, if you travel, you could do video calls and everything, It ultimately is a balance, right? Everyone will see it in a very different note and different way. So it's really understanding that where do you yourself find it's kind of the threshold or the mark on like, this is how much I feel like I have to do. And I imagine this is probably also the same for your husband when he thinks about it. Hey, as a son, how much do I need to do to get over my own barrier that I'm fulfilling my duty sufficiently, right? So the way I see it is also that it's always a very personal thing as well, compared to, like, of course, there's the practical consideration, like you say, how much time am I spending or how much money am I spending, those kind of very real things that we need to talk about. But I think internally it's a lot about understanding yourself and the self-awareness that you don't want to have that regret that if she does anything else does happen to her, touch wood, you will feel that, hey, I spend the last moments with her, I don't feel as much regret about it. I think that's one of the more important issues where we can control internally within ourselves.
I do think that, you know, as travelers, everybody has their things, right? So when we're taking care of my mother-in-law, for example, my sister-in-law said, well, I'm going to take care of her 2 weekends in a row because Day of the Dead's coming up and it's very important in my family. They do their altar, you know, at their house. And I really want to, you know, she wants to have that tradition with her husband and her family. I do think that there is a little bit of a bias against travel, almost like travel's not, they don't see it as being necessary, you know, where it's okay to do celebrations or birthday parties. And I do think that sometimes they look at it like, oh, well, you went to Bacalar, like that's not the same level as celebrating Day of the Dead with your family. But I think everybody has the right to do what they want to do. And travel, for me, that's my mental health. I can't be cooped up. Like, for me, I need to have that stimulation. You know, I love meeting new people, having conversations. And I think they do have a little bit, you know, just in general, a little bit like it's frivolous or it's luxurious or something. Does that make sense?
Totally, because I have the same so-called like considerations and issue, in the sense of, like, I'm not a big person around festivals, especially in my local culture. I love to see the festivals overseas because it's a cultural experience, but like I don't celebrate a lot of things like extensively in some sense. Like I'm not big on even my own birthday and stuff like that. Whereas my parents, being the traditional self, obviously there are certain festivals that are very important in so-called the culture, right? And for me, they will always be wondering, like, why are you leaving before Chinese New Year, for example? And they'd be like, why don't you just stay for like 3 more months and then like spend the Chinese New Year? And then of course after that, there's always another festival that's coming out, you know?
There's always something.
And it is true in the sense that travel is always considered a privilege, right? Like being able to travel is a privilege. But I guess for, like you say, to some people, personally, that is like our joy, or that's our mental health, or that is what we kind of need to do, at least in a certain time period per year, right? So, and it's always, I always say that it's important, in order to take care of others, you have first must be able to take care of yourself. Only when you are in the right mental mindset, then you have something to give. If you don't even have like the thing for yourself, there's nothing to give, right? That's even worse.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would never want it to get to the point where I don't think my husband will feel that way, but I wouldn't want it to get to the point where I'm resenting, you know, right? Like I'm feeling resentment or I'm angry. And so for me, it's just necessary that we've made a lot of sacrifices, you know, in terms of, you know, work schedules. And my husband, he's not even working. He taking care of her is a full-time job, and that's fine. You know, we make financial sacrifices. It doesn't bother me, but I cannot give up travel. But that's just like my limit. But I'm very lucky in the sense that, you know, my husband, I do solo mom travel because I believe that's very, because when you travel with your kids, I love traveling with my family, but it's exhausting sometimes. So you do need that solo travel. So I'm very lucky that my husband is understanding of that. And sometimes he does trips by himself too.
Got it. Yeah, it's definitely a balance. I want to conclude this particular segment with one of the phrase you wrote, which I probably kind of can understand what it means, but I think there's probably a deeper definition from yourself when you think about this. You wrote that as long as I have roots and wings, right? And I thought that was very interesting, because I also do think that this is something that a lot of nomads consider, almost in the sense like, I want to travel, but sometimes you desire a base, right? And sometimes the family obviously is considered a base, even though it's not maybe a physical base, but mentally that is where your base is, right? Like having a family. So for you, how do you see it?
So that's definitely a compromise that I had to make with my husband, because I'm happy just moving all the time. I love moving. I don't feel a need to have one place. I hate stuff. I'm a total minimalist. And so I'm happy just living out of a suitcase. But my husband, you know, he grew up kind of living among his, you know, at his sister's house, then with his mom. Then, you know, he went to Mexico City. So it was really important for him to have a home. And so that's kind of where we are now, where we have this home base, right? We're super lucky in that we don't have a mortgage. We have a dilapidated house that we're fixing up, but we don't have a mortgage. So we still have the money to be able to travel. So I feel like it's the best of both worlds. When we travel, we take our cat because we don't know when we're coming back. So when we went to Huatulco, we were there for 2 weeks. We came back when we wanted to. When we went to Bacalar, we were there, I think, for like 12 days. But we definitely set everything up, close up the house with the expectation that if we want to stay for 6 months, we can.
Got it.
I have my computer always, so.
Yeah, so it seems like you're definitely weighing like certain decisions, and ultimately, obviously, because you're not like a solo traveler, you always have to consider two parts of it. And I think that is kind of where you find the balance between like personally, you're very keen on travel, obviously, but your roots are definitely surrounding your family. And of course, I'm sure as a mother, you definitely want to take care of your kids and everything. There's always a desire or a longing for, to be around them. And so it balances both things.
But I also think there's the practical side of it, being a digital nomad. I do like that we have property now. I like knowing that we have, that every year it's going to be worth more money, that we have an investment, because working for yourself, unless you're setting up your own pension, what do you have in the future? So there is that practical side of it too.
Got it. Yeah, that's a good balance, because I was discussing with a lot of nomads regarding owning a house, because it's normally considered an asset in terms of investment, obviously, but sometimes it's a liability in terms of the freedom to move, because obviously it's something that kind of ties you down, right? So I can see that you obviously found a balance between like working around your life in terms of like how that can fit into the whole picture of things, right? And I think this
actually, I want to interrupt you to tell you that my first house experience was horrible. So I didn't want to buy a house for a long time because I bought in the United States in 2008, which was like the big housing bubble, and I bought a house. But being a digital nomad, for me in the United States, you don't buy a house, you get a mortgage, you have debt. So one of the big benefits of Mexico and these other developing countries is that you can buy your house outright and you don't have any debt. And so it's a very different experience for me today having a house than when I had, oh my God, I was so stressed when I had a mortgage in the United States. It was so expensive. You have to pay property taxes. It was a nightmare compared to the situation now, just buying it outright.
That's interesting. Yeah, I reckon like the property space in so-called overseas market in that sense is always worth looking into, especially the developing countries. I think a lot of opportunities, but of course you need to be careful about like the administrative stuff, and especially if you're coming in as like a foreigner, how not to get scammed. A lot of people are trying
a lot of scams.
Yeah, a lot of people are trying to build houses in Bali, and they're like in a whole deep hole of like headaches and stuff. So I think it's always worth looking, but you just need to like figure out, like make sure you know what the hell you're doing, right? So this is a very interesting transition to, and I want to try and squeeze this topic in because this is probably very interesting to talk about in terms of your business, right? So one of the main things you do is Nomad Publishing, but you only started it like a couple of years ago. But before that, you were in the language education space, and as far as I know, you're actually making pretty good money for teaching English, because I don't assume that's the normal average income that people get from teaching English. So you obviously did well there. What made you decide to make the switch to publishing instead of what you have already studied?
I've always made really good money. I am a big proponent of interactive classes. So before the pandemic, I was teaching on OutSchool, and I was teaching group classes online. And my classes were, I make really great materials where if we're going to practice ordering food, like you're going to have a menu, you're going to have your check, you got to fill it out. My master's degree is in teaching and learning with technology. So I was really good at using Google Docs and Google Drive online whiteboards so that I would have these group classes, and the students were reading, writing, speaking, listening, doing everything they had to do in the language. And then and they were homeschooled students. So homeschooled students, I had this idea before I started teaching them that they're going to be like antisocial, that they're going to be like, I don't know, super religious or something like that. And then I started teaching them, and they're amazing. They're so mature. They're taking classes that are really interesting to them. Like they want to learn. And then when the pandemic happened, like all my sweet little homeschool children, the classes were filled up with just frustrated kids coming from the public school system. Parents were just putting their kids in anything. They were just like putting them in any class. It didn't matter what level they were. So the classes really were very different. And then my own daughter didn't have school. So now I have two little kids. I got a toddler and, a kindergartner at home. We're in quarantine. It was just super, super stressful. So luckily, I had the money where I just didn't work for, I think, like 8 months. We traveled, we lived in an all-inclusive hotel, no regrets. We just spent time as a family. And then I had the opportunity last year to start my own publishing company. And I said that this is perfect because as a teacher, I'm using all the same skills, but in a very different way.
Right. You chose a very interesting model in the sense of like, well, in the sense you're more of a publishing, I guess when you talk about Nomad Publishing, it's more of a publishing house. But one way I always saw it was that you're obviously like an author as well, but you chose to basically, I'm not sure if co-authoring is the right word, but your books includes the stories of multiple people rather than just yourself writing, right? What made you decide to go into that form of publishing or that kind of model?
So basically, travelers, we have too many stories. We have stories that we could talk for like 6 hours and there would be no break, right? We're fine. We have stories and we love to share our stories. So every time you meet up with someone like in a hostel, like you just immediately, I don't know, you just immediately make a friend. And so the idea is by having multiple authors in the book, because this is very much a trend right now in publishing. It's a trend in blogging. That companies don't just have one blogger now, they have a team. So the trend in publishing is these multi-author books. It's so much easier to write one chapter than to write an entire book. It's better for the reader. It's better for the reader because the reader, people don't have time. They don't have time. This way they can sit down and 15, 20 minutes, they're reading one story at a time. It's kind of like the chicken soup for the soul series that they had like 20 years ago. So the idea is that all of the authors, they pay to become part of the book. They pay because I'm helping them write it. Content editing, I hire an editor. We get amazing cover design and we launch it to make sure it's a best-selling book. So that's why they write their chapters, so that they are best-selling authors.
Got it. So they are still writing like at least the first piece, but then there will be an editor that also still has to look through everything and like
I help them outline their story because stories are the same. Stories have not changed in thousands of years. If you think about all the Disney movies, they're all kind of the same story, but we continue to watch them. So stories are the same. So I help them to make sure that they're positioning themselves as a hero, that they have a problem or an inner struggle, because if there's not an inner struggle, people don't finish reading it, right?
Got it. That's very interesting. Yeah. So it's almost like you have a template or like a know-how in terms of like what kind of flow makes sense. And then you take basically their story in the sense and then put it in this kind of flow and then basically form it into a book. That's very interesting because what I've seen is that you have published like 3 books and the 4th one is coming, right? Am I right to say that?
Yes. Actually, I have them here. If you saw my desk, it's a mess, but yeah. So I have 3.
Book the Flight, Born to Travel, and Nomads.
Yeah. So Nomads was a book about business women that travel, and Born to Travel was for families that traveled like right away with the baby. Like baby on the plane, traveling all over the world. And then Book the Flight Already is a book for that like bucket list trip, like that trip that you're looking forward to your whole life and does it meet the expectations or not.
Got it.
And then the book I'm working on now is for world schoolers. So this book is really about travel as education.
Yeah, world schooling is definitely a trend. I wouldn't even call it a trend. I think it's definitely something that's coming up really, really quickly.
Yes.
Right? When I'm just trying to stop myself from diving into world schooling because it's going to be like another 2 hours of chatting.
That's another podcast. But yeah.
We have to do that on another podcast, yeah, for sure. And I know you work with Lainey from Project World School before on certain projects, right? So I had a podcast with her and that was also amazing when we spoke about, she had a lot of perspective as well. So there's always a topic that I'm very interested. I mean, I'm not even world schooling anyone, but then like, this is just a very interesting topic.
Because we know, as an ex-teacher, we know that what's going on in a classroom is not the best way to learn. We know because we learn teaching theories. We know that being immersed and going through the experience, traveling and learning it goes together so well. It's like a lifelong learning situation.
Yeah, we have to talk about that next time because
I
want to go back to the publishing first in the sense that because the concept is so interesting because you're publishing so quickly, right? And because based off your model, you're getting stories from different people. How do you get inspiration on like what the book is going to be about?
I'm a big believer in like it comes to me like in the middle of the night. So what happened with this book is Lainey contacted me because she needed a location for the 10th World Schooling Summit. And she was working with someone in Oaxaca, but she said, oh my God, it's been months and this person has no location. She said, can you help me? and she started describing like what she was looking for, and she mentioned a water park, and I said, I know the CEO of the water park here from my last TEDx. Cool, perfect. So it literally took me like 10 minutes to get the location for the World Schooling Summit set up. And we were talking, and I was like, I have to do a world schooling book. Like, I have to, because we click so well. And the same thing, like, we're talking, and there is no world schooling book. There's nothing that's sharing the experiences of these families. You know, we know that online, people are looking for the information. They want the information, but online, there's just too much going on.
Right.
So I wanted to really have a book that shows we have people before their world schooling. We have people whose children are 4 years old and they know they're never going to traditional school. We have empty nesters and like everything in between.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like a very interesting concept. And most of the books, actually, the way you mentioned it, the themes are actually very, very specific. I would say, like, it drills down to very specific niches on like what's happening, and is the plan to like publish more and more of these books on with different themes?
Well, actually, my plan for 2023, because there's so many ideas for books. I'm never going to get to all of the ideas. So what I actually am finishing up is a program to help writers and teachers, because teachers are just, there's a mass exodus from teaching. Teachers are like getting out of the occupation, like, and I feel that because I got burnt out too. So I'm going to be helping them start their own publishing companies, because I know that they have the skills already to do it. And they can go in, it doesn't have to be travel. Some people do business books, some people do artistic books, some people do parenting books. But I would really like to help teachers do something that's not, you know, selling on Teachers Pay Teachers or online classes. There's so many other things that we can do with our skill set.
Got it. Yeah, that's very interesting perspective. I've never knew, as in like now that you mentioned it, I can kind of draw the connection between what you're saying, that there's a link correlation between like teaching and publishing per se. So that's actually quite insightful.
Most people want to write a book. Most successful adults want to write a book. What people don't realize is we can tell stories really easily when we're talking, but we use a different part of our brain to tell a story than to write a story.
That's my problem.
That's everybody's problem. Everybody's problem is writing, and just, it's so simple, right? You just got to go back to third grade and go back to how to write a story again. But that's the obstacle, and that's why I think teachers are just, they're ideal. They're ideal to help people get that story on the paper.
Got it. Okay, let's conclude with 3 quick fire questions for you. Okay. First, what are 3 of the most useful items in your travel bag, apart from the laptop and handphone, obviously?
Cell phone doesn't count. Does cell phone count?
Cell phone is obvious.
Okay.
Let's throw like 3 super personalized things.
Hard.
Apparently, this is a difficult question for a lot of people.
Okay. All right. I got one. Okay. So I got this. Actually, for my partner, it's a gimbal.
Right.
Okay. So this is a life changer if you're taking videos and you're walking, because you're not like, sometimes when people walk, it's like dizzying the movement. Yep. So this is something that we bring everywhere that we travel.
Nice.
I honestly, when we travel, I pretty much throw a couple bathing suits and a couple sundresses, and that's it. I don't bring a lot of stuff.
Awesome. So you're the minimalist traveler for sure.
Really, I don't know. I only bought shoes when I had to do TEDx last year. I haven't owned a pair of shoes in like 5 years. I have flip-flops. So
Gotcha. All right. What is this? This would probably be more closer to you. Is that what's a secret local tip about living in Mexico that not many people would know about?
Most of the sales, like the local sales, is on the Facebook Marketplace. So if you're looking, so if you're looking for a rental, I buy everything off the Facebook Marketplace at this point. But any services, you're going to get a much better price on the Facebook Marketplace than on like the real estate websites. If it's in English, like it's overpriced. Anything that's in English is overpriced. And the cool thing about Facebook is Facebook has automatic translation.
Right.
So you don't have to worry about speaking Spanish. If you're just looking at the listings, it automatically translates it into your profile language.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's definitely a good tip. And lastly, what's the most important thing to consider when you're traveling with a family?
I feel like people would say safety, but I'm not going to go there. I think the most important thing when I'm traveling with my family is not to get stressed out. We slow travel. When we just went to Bacalar, this is like Murphy's Law of parenting. We ended up in the ER because our daughter got dehydrated and was running a fever. And so we stayed a couple extra days because that's what happens with kids. They get sick all the time, or they don't, they're cranky one day, you try to do a tour, it doesn't work out. I think the most important thing is that you have to go at the kid's pace. It's more important that you're enjoying the time than what you're actually doing and seeing, checking things off on your list. So we did this tour, we went to the Mayan ruins. You really just have to relax and enjoy the time together.
Got it. Yeah, that I've heard someone mention before, like especially when you're traveling with a baby, the baby tend to reflect like the parents' mood.
They
So
do.
like if you are right, so if you're anxious or you are like scared because it's the first time you're bringing your baby out, that's even worse because then the kid feels it and then he or she gets like anxious as well and starts crying, and then the whole thing is like it's like a snowball that keeps rolling and rolling, and you're like, shit, now it's going downhill really quickly.
And stuff always happens when we had on our trip to Bacalar, and my brother came down, so we were with my brother too. The Airbnb canceled an hour before check-in. Like everything that could go wrong went wrong, but we just rolled with it. And actually everything turned out better than we thought it was going to turn out. But we did have we stumbled a lot. But I think I'm so super lucky with my job because it's mine. It's flexible. I do it on my phone most of the time. I think it would be much harder if people are coming from like, they're 9 to 5 and they only have 5 days of vacation. I think that's where the stress comes in.
Yeah, definitely the I'll say the mindset and the mood makes a difference on how you adapt to the situation. Definitely. Okay, and lastly, where can people find you basically to find out more about, regardless if they want to look for you to publish or like they want to figure out like family travel stuff, how do they connect with you?
So I am super, super happy that I got rid of my website a few months ago and nobody noticed. So I'm the type of person, I can't have a website because I want to know everything and I spend too much time like learning HTML and coding, and I don't need to know that. So it's best to connect with me just directly on Facebook or LinkedIn.
Got it. And they will find by your name. That's the best way to look for it.
Yeah, they can just look for Sara Tyler, and that's the best way. I really like, I don't do like applications for my books. I like to talk to people personally. I don't have a virtual assistant. Like I like to get in there myself.
Sounds good. Yeah, sounds good. I will drop the links because I definitely have your LinkedIn and Facebook. So I will drop the links in the show notes for the listeners, for anyone who want to connect with Sara. All right, thanks Sara for coming on today and sharing. That was a very fun session that can definitely drag like 2 more hours. If I were to touch on everything that I was like keen to sidetrack on, but I had to control myself.
I know. We'll have to do another one on world schooling and on the TEDx.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. So nice to speak with you.